He was a millionaire tired of being loved only for what he had. She was a quiet cleaning lady with a soul no one could reach. What he didn't expect was to discover that this woman could be his fiancée, and she was still a virgin. If you like love and romance stories, watch until the end, subscribe to this channel, and leave a comment saying where you're listening from. Stay tuned. Alexander Morgan never knew what love was. Raised under the emotional rigidity of his father, a tycoon who built an empire with iron, cement, and clenched fists, he learned early on that feelings were signs of weakness, dangerous distractions. In the corporate battlefield, Richard Morgan didn't hug his son. He didn't smile in family photos. When Alexander turned 10, he received a mahogany desk and a calculator as a gift. Numbers don't lie, son. People do. That's what he heard every day, as he watched his father sign contracts that decided the fate of thousands of people, with the same coldness with which he chose his tie in the morning. His father's office always smelled of Cuban cigars and varnished wood. The black leather-lined walls displayed framed contracts like war trophies, each representing a victory over some adversary who had dared to challenge the Morgan Empire. Richard spoke little, but when he did, each word cut like sharp glass. "Never trust anyone completely, Alexander, not even me." And he would laugh, a sound without warmth, while signing documents that transformed other people's dreams into nightmares, or nightmares into fortunes, depending on which side of the desk you were sitting on. Alexander grew up in that glacial environment, learning to read balance sheets before he could read children's stories. At 15, he was already accompanying his father to meetings where men in dark suits decided which companies would live or die. He observed in silence how Richard demolished opponents with cold smiles and calculated handshakes, each gesture a blade wrapped in silk. "Power, my son, isn't gained by being nice, it's gained by being necessary. And when you're necessary, people will tolerate even your cruelty." The lessons were delivered during silent dinners in the Ridgewood Estates mansion, where the sound of silverware against French porcelain echoed like Morse code for loneliness. Richard told business stories the way other fathers told fairy tales, but his narratives always ended with someone losing everything. "See that man in the photo, Alexander?" He would point to a photograph on the office wall. "He was my best friend in college. Today he's bankrupt because he trusted me. Never forget, in the end, the one who survives is the one who knows when to stop being loyal." When Richard died of a massive heart attack at 62 during a board meeting, Alexander inherited more than money. He inherited a legacy of distrust, a fortune built on disposable relationships, and a loneliness he didn't even know existed. The funeral was as crowded as an art auction, with executives, politicians, and businessmen measuring each other across the coffin. They were all there not to offer condolences, but to sniff out opportunities in the still warm carcass of the empire. Alexander received the condolences with the same impassive expression he had learned to use in difficult meetings. Firm handshakes, direct gaze, economical words. "My condolences, Alexander. Your father was a great man." "Thank you very much. He would certainly approve of knowing you came." It was a play he knew by heart, where everyone represented characters they privately despised. Nobody really cried, not even him. It was 3 days after the burial that the family lawyer, Dr. Thomas Wilson, approached Alexander with an expression that differed from his usual calculated coldness. There was something in the will that needed to be discussed privately, away from the ears of the board of directors and the legal vultures already circling the inheritance. In the office that still smelled of his dead father's cigar, Thomas handed Alexander an envelope sealed with red wax, the Morgan family seal impressed on the surface like a mark of ancestral ownership. "Your father left specific instructions about this," said Thomas, nervously adjusting his glasses in an unusual manner. "He said you should only read it when you were officially in control of everything, and that I should be present to ensure you understand there is no legal loophole whatsoever." The letter was handwritten, something extraordinarily rare from Richard, who always dictated everything to efficient, impersonal secretaries. The trembling handwriting revealed it had been written shortly before his death, perhaps when symptoms of the heart attack were already manifesting. "Alexander," the letter said, "you have inherited my empire, but not my wisdom. I built all this without ever knowing the real price of what I conquered. The man who commands lives without knowing the pain of the invisible will not inherit what truly matters. Go to where no one knows your name. Only then will you know that which even money cannot buy. 3 months at the Grand Summit, as a common employee. Without this experience, half the inheritance will be donated to institutions that care for those our businesses have left behind. Consider this my final lesson, and perhaps my first act of love for you. Alexander read the letter 10 times, each word echoing in his mind like shots in a cave. It was impossible. He, who commanded boardrooms and decided million-dollar mergers with a nod of his head, living as an ordinary employee, cleaning bathrooms and changing light bulbs, the idea revolted and intrigued him simultaneously. Dr. Wilson explained with forced patience that there was no legal escape. Richard had been meticulous as always, anticipating every attempt at contestation. Either Alexander fulfilled the requirement, or he would lose 50% of everything he had just inherited. That night, alone in the penthouse apartment that had been his gilded prison for so long, Alexander stared at the city below through the bulletproof glass that separated him from the real world. New York shone like a giant electronic circuit, each light representing a life he had never cared to know, a story he had never heard, a pain he had systematically ignored. He held his father's wristwatch, an old Patek Philippe that had always been on Richard's wrist, but which curiously had stopped years ago. Perhaps there was something he needed to understand about lost time. 2 weeks later, Alexander Morgan disappeared from the New York corporate scene like a well-dressed ghost. Officially, he was on an extended business trip through Europe, negotiating the acquisition of a Swiss hotel chain. In reality, he was driving along the winding roads of the Smoky Mountains toward the Grand Summit, a luxury hotel isolated in the mountains that had been one of his father's first acquisitions, bought decades ago from a bankrupt traditional family who preferred to sell everything rather than see their heritage auctioned off. The hotel emerged in the morning mist like a stone castle extracted from some Gothic tale, imposing and melancholy, with its pointed towers cutting through the grey sky and windows that looked like tired eyes watching the serpentine road. Alexander parked the used Civic he had bought with cash and took a deep breath of the rarefied mountain air. For 3 months he would be Alex Santos, maintenance employee, an ordinary man with an invented past and an uncertain future. He tucked his father's broken watch into the pocket of his cheap plaid shirt, adjusted the worn backpack on his shoulders, and walked to the service entrance. It was strange to see the Grand Summit from that angle, through the narrow corridors where hurried employees carried trays and bed linens, where the smell of cleaning products replaced the subtle scent of imported flowers that perfumed the main halls. This was the invisible world that sustained the glamour he had always known. Mrs. Martha, the human resources manager, was a 50-year-old woman with grey hair tied in a rigid bun and eyes that seemed capable of detecting lies from miles away. She examined Alexander's forged documents with the same attention a detective examines evidence. "Alex Santos," she murmured, 28 years old, previous hotel experience in Denver. "Why do you want to work here in the middle of nowhere?" Alexander had rehearsed the answer during the trip. "I need some time away from the city, Ma'am. Personal problems." The disguised truth always worked better than elaborate lies. A lesson he had learned by watching Richard negotiate dubious contracts with a smile on his face. "Problems with a woman?" asked Mrs. Martha with the characteristic frankness of the countryside. Alexander nodded, allowing her to draw her own conclusions. "Well, you'll have time to think here. The work is hard, but honest. Blue uniform for maintenance, hours from 6 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon, Sundays off. No absences, no delays, no slacking. You can start tomorrow." The room assigned to him was in the basement, in a wing designated for employees who came from other cities. It was small, with a twin bed, a metal cabinet and a tiny window overlooking the service parking lot. Alexander sat on the bed and looked around, trying to process the reality. He had spent his entire life in hotel suites that cost more per night than that room would cost for an entire year. On the first morning, he woke up to the noise of colleagues preparing for work, voices whispering so as not to wake those still sleeping, water running in the communal showers, the sound of heavy boots in the concrete corridor. Alexander put on the blue uniform for the first time and looked at himself in the small, foggy mirror. The man who stared back at him was a stranger, someone who could go unnoticed in a crowd, exactly what his father had planned. His direct supervisor was Joe, a 40-year-old man with calloused hands and an easy smile that contrasted with the hardness of the work. "So you're the new Alex," he said, extending his hand in a firm handshake. "Welcome to the team. Here everyone works together, and nobody is better than anyone else. Rich or poor, when you wear this uniform, you're equal." The first few weeks were a silent torture. Alexander, accustomed to commanding with a gesture, now received orders on how to change a faulty lock or unclog a drain. His hands, which only knew the soft touch of Italian leather on the steering wheels of imported cars, now became rough from handling tools and chemicals. His back ached from carrying heavy equipment through the endless corridors of the hotel. But something strange began to happen. The co-workers, who initially viewed him with the natural suspicion reserved for outsiders, gradually began to accept him. They laughed at his clumsy attempts to fix a shower, taught him tricks to save time and effort, shared the bitter coffee from the employees' break room during breaks. Alexander discovered that there was a camaraderie in that world that he had never experienced in the air-conditioned offices of New York. "You're kind of strange, Alex," said Carlos, a veteran electrician who had worked at the hotel for 15 years, during a lunch break. "You talk too nicely, walk too properly. It's like you're always expecting someone to serve you coffee." The others laughed, but without malice. It was just the honest observation of someone who knows people. Alexander forced a smile and shrugged. "My mother was a teacher. She was always on my case about posture and the way I speak." Another half-truth. His mother had died when he was 12, but during the few years they had spent together, she really did insist on good education as a way to stand out socially. It was during the third week that he saw her for the first time. Emily Williams appeared in the corridor of the old wing of the hotel like an ethereal apparition, pushing a cleaning cart with precise and silent movements. Alexander was fixing a dripping faucet when she passed by, and something about the way she walked made him look up. It wasn't just the upright posture or the natural elegance of her gestures. It was something deeper, a magnetic quality that seemed to completely clash with the environment. She wore the same grey uniform as the other maids, but on her it seemed like borrowed clothes, as if she was playing a role in a theatrical piece. Her brown hair was tied in a simple bun, but some rebellious strands framed a face that Alexander was sure he had seen before, perhaps in a dream or in an old painting. Her eyes, when she raised them for a second in his direction, were a deep green that resembled ancient forests, full of secrets and untold sorrows. "Who is that?" he asked Joe when she disappeared around a corner of the corridor. "Emily. Works in the old wing, that part that's closed to guests. Arrived about 6 months ago, kind of mysterious. Nobody knows much about her or where she came from. Does her job right, doesn't bother anyone, doesn't participate in the little parties the gang organizes." Joe lowered his voice. "Between us, I think she's running from something, or someone. A pretty woman like that doesn't become a maid by choice, if you know what I mean." Alexander understood perfectly, and for the first time since he had arrived at the Grand Summit, he felt a curiosity that had nothing to do with fulfilling the requirement of his father's will. Emily Williams carried secrets like other people, carry photographs in their wallets, always present but hidden from curious eyes. In the silent corridors of the old wing of the Grand Summit, where dust danced in beams of light filtered through windows blurred by time, she moved with the precision of someone who had learned to exist without making noise, without leaving traces, without arousing unnecessary attention. The old wing was her private kingdom, a labyrinth of rooms that had once hosted authorities and celebrities decades ago, now abandoned like inconvenient memories. The walls still preserved vestiges of decadent luxury, gold-patterned wallpaper peeling at the edges, crystal chandeliers covered by white sheets like suspended ghosts, period furniture protected by covers that transformed them into mysterious sculptures. It was there that Emily found peace. Among the silent furniture and heavy curtains that filtered the external light, she could lower her guard for a few moments, allow her shoulders to relax, her breathing to become deeper. She hummed old songs while polishing mirrors framed in silver, melodies that her grandmother used to sing on hot afternoons in Charleston, when Emily still believed that the world was a place where dreams came true for poor but determined girls. Emily had arrived at the Grand Summit on a night of torrential rain 6 months ago, driving a yellow Fiat Uno that sounded more like an ambulance than a car. She brought only a small suitcase and an iron determination to completely disappear from the life she had known until then. Mrs. Martha hired her that same night, more out of compassion than necessity. There was something in the look of that young woman that spoke of elegant desperation, of someone who had lost everything but refused to lose dignity. What nobody at the hotel knew was that Emily Williams had been, until a few months before, Emily Bennett Crawford, heiress of one of the most traditional families in South Carolina. She had grown up between piano and French lessons, debutante balls and dinners where the political future of the state was decided. Her father, Colonel William Crawford, commanded an empire of sugar and politics that extended from the inland to the coast, and Emily was his most precious jewel and his most valuable bargaining chip. At 22, Emily discovered that she had been promised in marriage to Victor Harrison, a businessman 40 years older, owner of a fortune built on questionable investments and dangerous political connections. The agreement had been sealed between her father and Victor at a poker table. On a night when the stakes rose beyond money and reached daughters, Emily would be delivered as payment for a gambling debt that would ruin the family if not paid. "It's for the good of all of us, Emily," her father said on the morning he announced the forced engagement. "Victor is an influential man. You will have everything a woman could desire." But Emily saw in her father's eyes not paternal love, but the relief of someone who had found a way out of problems he had created with his own greed. And in Victor's eyes, when he came to dinner at the Crawfords' house to better know his bride, Emily saw something that made her tremble inside, the hunger of a predator who had finally captured his prey. The escape happened on the eve of the wedding. While the house bustled with final preparations, florists arranging white orchid arrangements and waiters adjusting the tables in the main hall, Emily simply disappeared. She left behind the wedding dress that cost more than many families, earn in a year, the family jewels that would be her inheritance, the university diplomas that attested to her refined education. She took only the money she managed to gather by discreetly selling some less conspicuous pieces from her personal collection. For months, Victor searched for her obsessively. He hired private detectives, offered rewards, used contacts throughout the country. For him, Emily wasn't just a lost bride. It was a matter of wounded pride and unclaimed property. A man like him did not accept being abandoned by a woman, especially one he already considered his by acquired right. At the Grand Summit, Emily built a new identity based on anonymity. She woke up before dawn, had coffee alone in the employee break room while others were still sleeping, started work when the corridors were still immersed in the morning twilight. She avoided long conversations, politely declined invitations to the gatherings that colleagues organized on weekends, always remained courteous but distant. But there was something about Emily that couldn't be completely suppressed, no matter how simple the clothes she wore or how menial the work she performed. It was the way she held a broom with the same elegance with which she had once held fans at high society balls. It was the way she pronounced certain words, revealing an education that couldn't be completely disguised. It was the way her eyes lit up when she found some beautiful object lost in the old wing, a porcelain vase forgotten on a shelf, a framed miniature fallen behind a piece of furniture, as if she recognized in each piece something of a world that had been hers. And it was precisely this indefinable quality that caught Alexander's attention when he saw her for the first time. He had grown up surrounded by people who tried to appear more refined than they were, and had developed a keen instinct for detecting authenticity. In Emily, he immediately saw that simplicity was a mask, not a natural condition. In the days following their first encounter, Alexander began to look for excuses to work near the old wing. He invented non-existent problems with the plumbing in that section, offered to change burned-out light bulbs that worked perfectly, found elaborate reasons to pass through the corridors where Emily worked. She noticed, of course, a woman who had spent months looking over her shoulder, alert to any sign of danger, had developed a keen radar for detecting when she was being observed. In the first casual encounters, Emily treated him with the same cold courtesy she extended to all colleagues. A polite greeting, a quick smile that didn't reach her eyes, a conversation that lasted the strictly necessary before she found an excuse to move away. But Alexander noticed small details that betrayed her curiosity. The way she took a few seconds, longer to respond when he asked a question, as if she were carefully choosing her words. The way she averted her gaze not out of disinterest, but out of excess interest that needed to be controlled. One afternoon, Alexander found her in the abandoned library of the old wing, a room that probably hadn't received visitors in years. Emily was standing in front of a tall bookshelf on tiptoe, trying to reach a book that was almost at the top. She wore a simple dress under her work apron, and the position revealed the delicate curve of her neck, the elegant line of her extended arms. "Can I help?" offered Alexander, approaching without making noise. Emily startled, almost losing her balance. For a moment, their eyes met, and Alexander saw something she normally kept well hidden. Pure vulnerability, as if she had been caught in an intimate moment. But the mask quickly returned to place. "No need, thank you. I was just checking if there's moisture in the books on this shelf." The lie was obvious but polite. Alexander smiled. Of course. Moisture is a serious problem for old books. He easily reached the volume she was trying to get, a copy of The Scarlet Letter, with a cover worn by time. "This one seems especially vulnerable to moisture." Emily blushed slightly. "Nathaniel Hawthorne has always been resistant to time," she replied without thinking, revealing a familiarity with literature that didn't match her supposed function. It was the first crack in Emily Williams' armor. And Alexander, even without knowing who she really was, felt that he had found something worth more than all the empires he would ever inherit. The days following the encounter in the library created a silent dance between Alexander and Emily, a subtle game of approaches and retreats that neither admitted they were playing. Alexander discovered that Emily had precise schedules. She always arrived 15 minutes before the official workday, ate lunch alone at 11:30 when the cafeteria was still empty, and finished work exactly on time, not a minute more or less. It was a military routine that spoke of someone accustomed to rigid discipline or the need to remain invisible. He began to adjust his own schedules to hers, not in an obvious way, but with the subtlety of someone who had learned to negotiate million-dollar contracts by observing the behavior of opponents. He arrived a little earlier, extended his lunch hour, found tasks that needed to be done exactly in the places Emily would pass by. It was behavior that surprised him. He had never needed to make an effort to get a woman's attention. In the world where he grew up, his last name was already a sufficient introduction. Emily, in turn, began to notice the patterns. She had spent the last few months hypervigilant, mentally cataloguing the habits of each person around her as a security measure, and the changes in Alex's behavior did not go unnoticed. What intrigued her was not just the interest he showed. Men always showed interest. It was something she had learned to deal with since adolescence. What disturbed her was the way he looked at her, as if he were trying to decipher a complex enigma, not simply admiring a beautiful woman. The second real conversation happened on a Thursday afternoon, when Emily was organizing cleaning supplies in a narrow pantry, and Alexander appeared at the door carrying a box of light bulbs. "Excuse me," he said, hesitating at the entrance. "I need to store these light bulbs here." Emily moved away to make room, but the space was too small and they ended up close enough for Alexander to smell the subtle perfume she wore. Something discreet that reminded him of wildflowers, completely different from the expensive and distinctive perfumes that women in his social circle preferred. "You're not from this region," Emily said suddenly, while organizing disinfectant bottles on a shelf. Alexander almost dropped the box of light bulbs. "How do you know?" "Your accent. It's from New York, but not from the outer boroughs, and your hands—" She glanced quickly at his hands, which were holding the box. They're hands of someone who hasn't worked with tools all his life. You still have the mark of the ring you recently removed." It was true. Alexander had removed the ring with the family crest before coming to the hotel, but the lighter mark on the skin was still visible. Emily had an impressive clinical eye for details, perhaps the fruit of years living in a family where knowing how to read people could be a matter of political survival. "And you?" asked Alexander, regaining his balance. "You're not from here either." Emily closed the lid of a bottle with more force than necessary. "What makes you think that?" "The way you talk about books, as if you knew real libraries, not just shelves, in ordinary houses. And yesterday you were humming a song that a person I knew used to play on the piano. It's not the type of music you learn on the radio." They were silent for a moment, each processing how much they had unintentionally revealed. Emily finished organizing the products and turned to leave, but Alexander gently blocked the passage with his arm. "I won't ask where you came from, or why you're here," he said, lowering his voice. "Just, if you ever want to talk about books or music or anything that isn't work, I'd like that." Emily studied him carefully, looking for signs of falsity or ulterior motives. What she saw was something unexpected, genuine loneliness. There was in Alex's eyes a need that she recognized because she saw the same thing in the mirror every morning. "Why would I do that?" she asked, but without hostility. "Because sometimes it's good to remember that we're more than our uniforms and our obligations, and because—" he hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because I have the impression that you're also trying to forget something, and maybe it's easier to forget when you have company." It was a risky observation, one that could have made her retreat definitively, but Emily surprised herself by responding, "The library in the old wing, tomorrow, after work, for 15 minutes. 15 minutes became half an hour. Half an hour became an hour. In 3 weeks they established a ritual. They met in the abandoned library every afternoon, always after the hotel's activity diminished. Emily brought tea in a thermos that she kept hidden in her locker. Alexander contributed with cookies he bought in town during his days off. They talked about books, mainly. Emily knew classic literature with the depth of someone who had had private tutors and free time to read for pleasure. Alexander discovered that he enjoyed discussing abstract ideas, something he had never done at the business dinners where he had grown up. He talked about philosophy with the passion of someone who had studied the subject out of obligation, but had belatedly discovered the intellectual pleasure it provided. But they also talked about smaller, more intimate things. Emily said she missed tending a garden, something she did in the house where she grew up. Alexander admitted that he had never learned to cook and survived on frozen food when he wasn't in restaurants. She laughed. It was the first time he had seen her really laugh, a low and musical sound that echoed among the dusty shelves like a promise of happiness. "You should learn," she said. "Cooking is liberating. It's creating something from nothing, feeding people you like. It's one of the few truly generous acts that exist." "You could teach me," suggested Alexander, trying to sound casual. Emily became serious immediately. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not?" "Because," she hesitated, playing with the strap of the thermos, "because I'm trying not to get involved with anyone. It's safer that way." "Safer for whom?" "For everyone." It was always like that. Moments of growing intimacy, followed by sudden retreats, as if Emily had an internal alarm that went off whenever the conversation became too personal. Alexander learned to respect these limits, but he also learned to memorize them, to map the areas where she felt comfortable and those that were forbidden territory. What he didn't know was that Emily was fighting an internal battle every night. Lying in the narrow bed of the employee room she shared with a silent chambermaid, she would look at the ceiling and wonder if she was being reckless. Alex awakened in her something she had decided to bury forever, the desire to trust someone, to lower her guard, to be seen and accepted for who she really was. But Emily knew that men like Alex, educated, charming, apparently gentle, could be the most dangerous of all. Victor had also been gentle in the beginning, before the marriage was announced and he began to treat her as acquired property. And there was something about Alex that didn't fit perfectly into the story he told about himself. The way he sometimes forgot to use slang from manual workers, as if he were playing a role. The way his eyes moved when he lied about his past, always to the left, as if he were accessing a constructed memory, not a lived one. One night, Emily made a decision that would change everything. She went to the hotel reception after midnight, when only the night security guard was on duty, and asked to use the computer for a few minutes. "Family emergency," she lied, and the guard who liked her allowed it. Emily typed Alex Santos Denver into Google and waited. The results were few and vague, some social media pages with incomplete profiles, nothing that confirmed the story, he had told. Then she tried a different search, maintenance employee Grand Summit combined with other keywords. That's how she found an old photo of the hotel from a newspaper article about tourism in the Smoky Mountains. In the photo, taken 2 years earlier, a group of employees was posing in front of the main building. Emily recognized several faces: Joe, Mrs. Martha, Carlos. But Alex wasn't there. If he really had been working in maintenance for years, as he had suggested, he should appear in an official photo like that. Emily turned off the computer with trembling hands. Alex Santos was a lie. The question now was to discover what truth was hidden behind the farce, and whether that truth represented the kind of danger from which she had spent the last few months fleeing. The change. In Emily's behavior was subtle, but Alexander noticed it immediately. She continued to appear at the library meetings, but there was a new tension in her shoulders, a different way of looking at him, no longer with cautious curiosity of someone getting to know someone, but with the minute examination of someone, assessing a potential threat. The conversations became more superficial, punctuated by silences loaded with unasked questions. Alexander tried to ignore the change initially, attributing it to the natural ups and downs of someone carrying heavy secrets. But when Emily began to find excuses to end the meetings earlier, headache, extra work, vague commitments, he knew something had fundamentally changed between them. It was on a Friday afternoon, when a sudden storm transformed the mountain, sky into a grey curtain of torrential rain, that everything came to light. Alexander had finished work earlier due to the weather and decided to look for Emily in the old wing. He found her in the library, but she wasn't alone. She had spread a collection of papers on one of the dusty tables, newspaper clippings, printouts of internet pages, some old photographs. When she saw him at the door, she didn't try to hide what she was doing. Instead, she held up one of the photographs, a black and white image that Alexander recognized immediately. It was an official photo of the board of Morgan Incorporated, taken 5 years earlier. His father was in the center, surrounded by other executives, and Alexander appeared on the right side, younger, wearing a suit that cost more than any hotel employee's annual salary. "You're going to explain to me who you really are," said Emily, with a calmness that was more frightening than any shout. "Or would you prefer that I find out on my own?" Alexander felt the world collapse around him. For weeks he had allowed himself to believe that he could just be Alex Santos, an ordinary man who worked with his hands and talked about books with a mysterious woman in an abandoned library. The fantasy had been so seductive that he had almost managed to forget it was temporary. "How did you find out?" he asked, closing the library door behind him. "Do you really want to know?" Emily organized the papers in an orderly pile, each movement controlled and precise. "I can start with the way you hold a screwdriver, as if it were an alien object, or the way you refer to the people who work here, always with a subtle distance, as if they were a different species from yours. Or maybe the fact that you don't appear in any official hotel photos from the last 3 years. Alexander approached the table, but Emily took a step back, maintaining distance between them. "But what really convinced me," she continued, "was finding this photo in an article about young billionaires in America. Alexander Morgan, 30, years old, heir to the most powerful civil construction empire in the country, president of the company since the mysterious death of his father 7 months ago." "My father's death wasn't mysterious," said Alexander automatically. "It was a heart attack." "Of course it was. Emily picked up another paper from the pile. But it's interesting how you disappeared from the specialized media exactly at the time when Alex Santos started working here. Fascinating coincidence. Alexander pulled out a chair and sat down heavily. The weight of the lie he had built over months collapsed on his shoulders like an avalanche. "You don't understand," he began. "I didn't choose to be here for fun or to deceive anyone. It's a requirement of my father's will. 3 months living as a common employee, or I lose half the inheritance." Emily laughed, but it was a sound without humor. "Oh, how romantic. The prince disguised as a commoner to learn life lessons. And what am I in this story? The peasant princess. Who's going to teach you about true love? It's not like that." "No?" Emily leaned over the table, resting her hands on the dusty surface. "Then tell me, Alexander Morgan, what exactly do you intend to do when the 3 months are over? Go back to your penthouse in New York and tell your billionaire friends how interesting it was to play poor for a while?" The question hit Alexander like a punch to the stomach because he had no answer. During the weeks of living with Emily, he had carefully avoided thinking about what would happen when the deadline of the will ended. It was as if the real world had been suspended, allowing him to live in a bubble where he could be just a man in love with an extraordinary woman. "I fell in love with you," he said, and the words came out with more desperation than he had intended. "You fell in love with a fantasy," replied Emily, straightening up, "with a mysterious maid who made your clandestine meeting seem like a romantic adventure. You know nothing about who I really am. Then tell me." "Why? So you can decide if I'm worthy of your interest? So you can evaluate me as a possible acquisition for your collection of authentic experiences." Alexander stood up abruptly, knocking over the chair. "That's unfair, and you know it." "Unfair?" Emily gathered the papers in a pile and put them in a folder. "You know what's unfair? It's discovering that the man with whom you started to care about lied about literally everything from day one. It's realizing that every conversation, every moment of intimacy, every time you lowered your guard was based on an elaborate farce." "It wasn't a farce," insisted Alexander. "I lied about who I am, but everything I felt for you was real, every word we exchanged, every word," Emily interrupted him, "including the stories about your humble childhood, about working, since you were young to help your family, about not having money to study at a good university." Alexander fell silent. All those stories had been invented to sustain his false identity, small lies woven to create a coherent past for Alex Santos. "That's what I thought," said Emily, heading for the door. "Emily, wait." Alexander followed her. "You're right to be furious, but give me a chance to explain." She stopped at the door and turned around. For a moment, Alexander saw not anger in her eyes, but a deep sadness that reminded him of the first time he had seen her crying alone. "You know what? The saddest part of all this is, Alexander," she said softly. "It's that I was lying too. Every story I told about myself, every detail of my life that I shared with you, all lies. The difference is that my lies were to protect myself. Yours were for fun." Before Alexander could respond, Emily had disappeared down the dark corridor, leaving him alone in the library with the echo of his own lies reverberating among the dusty shelves. That night, Alexander knocked on the door of Emily's room on the employees' floor. The woman who shared the room with her, a shy chambermaid named Sonia, opened the door and said that Emily had left earlier without explaining where she was going or when she would return. Alexander waited in the lobby until the early hours, but she didn't appear. The next morning, Mrs. Martha summoned Alexander for a conversation in her office. On the desk was a handwritten letter of resignation and a key, the key to Emily's room. "She asked to give this to you," said Mrs. Martha, extending a sealed envelope, "and she asked me to tell you that she's even with all labor obligations. She left during the night." Alexander opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was just one line, written in the elegant handwriting he had learned to recognize. "Thank you for confirming what I already knew. Now I can leave." For the first time since his father's death, Alexander Morgan cried. Not the controlled and appropriate tears of a public funeral, but with the raw despair of someone who had just lost something he didn't know he could possess. And as he cried, alone in the hotel room that had become his prison, he realized that learning to be an ordinary man had cost much more than he had imagined. It had cost him the only person who made him feel truly human. Alexander spent the following 2 months at the Grand Summit, like a ghost of himself. He continued performing his maintenance tasks with mechanical efficiency, but colleagues noticed the change. The man who had begun to integrate into the group, who laughed at jokes during breaks and participated in conversations about football, had transformed into a silent and distant presence. Joe tried a few times to make conversation, but Alexander responded with polite monosyllables that discouraged any attempt at intimacy. The nights were the worst. Alexander walked the empty corridors of the hotel like a condemned man, always expecting to see Emily appear around a corner, always disappointed when he found only shadows and the echo of his own footsteps. He visited the abandoned library every night, sitting in the same chair where they had shared conversations that now seemed to belong to another life. The subtle scent of her perfume still lingered among the dusty shelves, a ghostly reminder that tortured and comforted him at the same time. During the day, he tried to distract himself by looking for clues about Emily's whereabouts. Discreetly, he asked the older employees if they knew where she had come from, if she had family in the region, if she had mentioned any place she might go. The answers were frustrating in their uniformity. Nobody knew anything about Emily beyond the fact that she had arrived on a rainy night and left in the same silent manner. It was Mrs. Martha who, inadvertently, provided the first real clue. In a casual conversation about the difficulty of finding reliable employees, she mentioned that Emily had presented impeccable documents on the day of hiring, but there was something about the address that didn't match up. She said she came from Denver, but the accent was from further away, from the south perhaps. And the professional references, when I called to verify, were all from companies that had recently closed. Too convenient, if you ask me. This information gave Alexander a direction for his searches. He began to investigate discreetly, using the limited resources available to him at the hotel. He borrowed the reception computer during his off hours, claiming the need to resolve banking issues. He spent hours browsing search sites, social networks, public records, looking for any trace of an Emily Williams who could be the woman he had met. It was during one of these search sessions that Alexander discovered something that left him cold. On a social page from Charleston, he found an old photo of a charity event, a gala ball to raise funds for a children's hospital. In the photo, among dozens of elegantly dressed people, he instantly recognized Emily's face. But she wasn't identified as Emily Williams. The caption read, "Emily Bennett Crawford, daughter of Colonel William Crawford, with fiancé Victor Harrison during the Hope Foundation charity ball." Alexander zoomed in on the image on the computer until he could clearly see the details. Emily wore a navy blue gala dress that enhanced her green eyes, elaborately styled hair, jewelry that probably cost more than the annual salary of all the hotel employees combined. Beside her, a man of about 50 possessively embraced her waist, smiling at the camera with the confidence of someone who had just acquired something valuable. But what most disturbed Alexander was the expression on Emily's face in the photo. There was no happiness there, just a mask of social courtesy that he now recognized, the same expression she used when she wanted to maintain emotional distance. It was the face of a woman who was playing a role, not living a genuine moment of happiness. Alexander copied the name Victor Harrison and began a new search. What he found made him understand why Emily had fled. Victor wasn't just a rich businessman. He was a man with dangerous connections, investigated multiple times for money laundering and association with criminal organizations. There were newspaper articles about his questionable business practices, lawsuits that mysteriously disappeared from courts, witnesses who changed their testimony or simply disappeared. And there was something more disturbing. Victor Harrison had invested heavily in Morgan Incorporated during the last years of Richard Morgan's life. Alexander found public documents that confirmed million-dollar loans, partnerships in construction projects, societies that connected the two men in ways that Alexander had never suspected. The discovery hit him like lightning. Emily hadn't just fled from an arranged marriage. She had fled from a man who had direct ties to Alexander's family, as much as she might not have known his real identity when they met. The connection between the two worlds they were trying to escape was real and dangerous. Alexander closed the computer with trembling hands. He finally understood why Emily had left so abruptly after discovering who he really was. It hadn't just been anger over the lie, it had been terror at discovering that the man she was falling in love with was the son of the business partner of the man she was fleeing from. That night, Alexander made a decision that would change everything. He called Dr. Thomas Wilson from a public phone in the nearest town, where he knew the call couldn't be traced back to him. "I need information about all the business my father did with Victor Harrison," he said without preamble when the lawyer answered. "Alexander, where are you? The board of directors is in panic. There are rumors that you—" "Answer my question, Thomas. It's urgent." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Victor Harrison financed several operations of the company in the last 5 years. Loans, partnerships, some offshore societies. Why do you want to know? Does he still have influence over the company? Considerable. In fact, with your prolonged absence, he has been pressuring the board to accelerate certain decision-making processes. There's a meeting scheduled for next week where your succession will be discussed, considering that you disappeared. Alexander felt the blood freeze in his veins. What kind of succession? If you don't return and officially assume the presidency, by the end of the month, the board can vote for your temporary replacement, and Victor, as one of the main creditors, would have a significant voice in that decision. And if I return now? It would still be complicated. Your unexplained absence has generated instability. Some board members question your leadership capability. It would be a difficult battle to regain full control. Alexander hung up the phone without saying goodbye. The trap was closing around him, and he finally understood the complexity of the game his father had set up. The will wasn't just about learning humility, it was about forcing him to choose between the empire and something more valuable. Richard had predicted that Alexander would find something at the Grand Summit that would change his perspective, and had architected the situation so that this choice would become inevitable. But there was a variable that neither Richard nor Alexander had foreseen. Emily was in real danger, and the man who threatened her had the power to destroy everything Alexander had inherited. For the first time since he had arrived at the hotel, Alexander felt truly alone. Emily had disappeared. His empire was being threatened from within, and he was stuck on a mountain wearing a blue uniform without any of the resources he had always taken for granted. But also, for the first time in his life, Alexander knew exactly what was worth fighting for. It wasn't for the company or the inheritance or the power he had always known. It was for a green-eyed woman who had taught him that there was something more valuable than all the empires in the world, the possibility of being loved for who he really was, not for what he possessed. The question now was whether there was still time to save her, and whether he was willing to sacrifice everything to try. Alexander's decision to abandon the Grand Summit before the deadline established by the will was made on a Monday morning, when he woke up with the crystal-clear certainty that 3 months of self-imposed penance weren't worth a lifetime of regret. He packed his few possessions in a worn backpack, left the blue uniform carefully folded on the narrow bed, and wrote a letter of resignation lying about a family emergency. Mrs. Martha received the news with surprise, but without questions. Temporary employees always had complicated stories. During the trip back to New York, driving the used Civic along the winding mountain roads, Alexander developed a plan that was both simple and desperate. He would use all the resources at his disposal to find Emily, even if that meant directly confronting Victor Harrison and exposing the dangerous connections between their families. If it was necessary to destroy the Morgan Empire to protect her, he was prepared for that sacrifice. But when he arrived at the penthouse apartment in New York, he found a surprise that completely changed his calculations. Sophia Reynolds was sitting in his living room, flipping through a decoration magazine as if she owned the place. She was impeccably dressed in a beige linen suit that probably cost more than the monthly salary of a Grand Summit employee, blonde hair perfectly arranged in soft waves, that framed a face that had been on magazine covers before she decided to dedicate herself to her family's business. "Finally," she said, without raising her eyes from the magazine. "I was beginning to think you had run away forever from this inconvenient responsibility of managing billions of dollars." Alexander let the backpack fall on the marble floor with a dull sound. "How did you get in here?" "Your doorman has known me for years, darling. Besides, technically speaking, we're still engaged." Sophia finally looked at him, examining him from head to toe with an expression that mixed amusement and disapproval. "My God, you look horrible. What kind of vacation was it that left you looking like a laborer?" "We're not engaged, Sophia. We never were, actually. Our parents made a business deal and used us as collateral. But that doesn't mean—" "Doesn't?" "Mean what?" Sophia rose gracefully, smoothing the fabric of her suit with calculated movements. "That we have mutual obligations? That our families built empires based on strategic alliances? That you can't simply disappear for months and expect the world to keep turning as if nothing had happened?" Alexander poured himself a whiskey from the bar he hadn't touched for months. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it helped him organize his thoughts. "What do you want, Sophia?" "I want you to stop playing hide-and-seek and assume the responsibilities you inherited. The board of directors is in panic, investors are nervous, and there are rumors in the market that Morgan Incorporated is facing leadership problems." She approached, leaving in the air a trail of expensive French perfume. "Besides, Victor Harrison has been asking very inconvenient questions about your ability to honor the commitments assumed by your father." The name of Victor made Alexander stiffen. What kind of questions? The kind that men like him ask when they detect weakness. Sophia helped herself to a glass of white wine she had left on the coffee table, as if she were a hostess receiving a guest in her own home. He has suggested to the board that perhaps an external intervention is necessary to stabilize the company, and naturally, he offered to assume that responsibility. Alexander felt his stomach turn. "He can't do that." "Yes, he can if he can prove that you are incompetent or incapable of fulfilling the obligations established by your father's will, and your mysterious absence of the last few months has provided exactly the ammunition he needed." Sophia took a sip of the wine, watching Alexander over the edge of the glass. "Unless, of course, you return now, marry me as planned, and demonstrate to the market that the leadership of Morgan is solid and stable. Never going to happen." "No?" Sophia smiled, but it was a cold expression that didn't reach her eyes. "Then perhaps you'd be interested to know about the research that Victor commissioned on a certain Emily Bennett Crawford, also known as Emily Williams." Alexander dropped the whiskey glass. The glass shattered against the marble floor, scattering bright fragments and the golden liquid in an irregular puddle. "Ah, now I have your attention," said Sophia with satisfaction. "Victor told me a fascinating story about a runaway bride he's been looking for months. Apparently, she hid in a mountain hotel where she met a mysterious employee who helped her feel safe again. How romantic, don't you think?" Alexander felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath his feet. How did we find out? Victor has considerable resources, Alexander. Private detectives, contacts in hotels throughout the country, access to records that ordinary people don't even imagine exist. Sophia walked to the panoramic window that gave a view of the city. It took time, but eventually someone recognized a photo of Emily in a small town near Gatlinburg. A florist remembered a beautiful woman who always bought the same flowers, white daisies, every week. "Where is she?" asked Alexander, his voice coming out as a whisper. "Safe, for now." Victor decided not to approach yet. "He's waiting to see how you'll react to a very reasonable proposal." Sophia turned to face him. "Marry me, publicly assume control of the company, honor all the agreements your father made with Victor, and Emily will remain free to live the simple life she chose. Refuse and, well, Victor is a man who always recovers what he considers his property." Alexander approached Sophia with slow and deliberate steps. When he was close enough to see the small lines of tension around her eyes, he said, "You have no idea what you're doing, do you?" I'm saving your company and possibly the life of the woman you apparently fell in love with during your poor man adventure. Sophia didn't back down, keeping her gaze steady. I'm offering a solution where everyone wins. Everyone except Emily. Emily made her choices. She chose to run away from an advantageous marriage, chose to hide as a common employee, chose to get involved with a man who lied about his identity. Sophia drank the rest of the wine in one gulp. If she suffers the consequences of those choices, the fault isn't mine. Alexander held Sophia's wrist, not with enough force to hurt her, but enough to make her understand that he was serious. If you or Victor touch a hair on her head, I destroy everything. The company, the agreements, the family alliances, all the dirty business that connects our worlds. I burn it all until nothing remains. Sophia smiled again, but this time there was nervousness behind the expression. You wouldn't do that. You'd lose billions. I've already lost the only thing that really matters, said Alexander, releasing her wrist. Money is just paper. Power is just illusion. But love is the only real thing that exists in this world of lies we've built. Sophia picked up the designer bag she had left on the sofa and headed for the door. Before leaving, she stopped and looked over her shoulder. You have until Friday to make a decision, Alexander. After that, Victor will get tired of waiting, and men like him are not known for their patience. When the door closed behind her, Alexander was left alone in the apartment that suddenly seemed more like a prison than a home. Through the window, New York stretched to the horizon like an ocean of concrete and lights, each window representing a life that followed its normal course while his silently collapsed. But for the first time since he had returned, Alexander smiled. Sophia and Victor had made a crucial mistake. They had assumed that he still cared more about the empire than about Emily. They didn't know that a man who spent months learning to live without luxury also learned to live without fear of losing. As Alexander picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Thomas Wilson's number. When the lawyer answered, he said only, I need you here now, and bring all the documents about my father's business with Victor. Harrison, we're going to find a way to bury this man using his own weapons. Dr. Thomas Wilson arrived at Alexander's apartment 2 hours later, carrying 3 leather briefcases full of documents and an expression that mixed relief at seeing the client alive with concern for what was to come. During Alexander's months of absence, the lawyer had become the involuntary guardian of secrets that could destroy reputations and bring down empires. First of all, said Thomas, organizing piles of contracts on the marble dining table, I need you to understand the dimension of what you're facing. Victor Harrison is not just an investor in Morgan. In recent years, he has become practically a hidden partner. Alexander examined the documents that Thomas meticulously spread out. Loan contracts with suspiciously low interest rates, partnerships in construction projects where Morgan provided the expertise and Victor provided funding with unclear origin, offshore societies registered in tax havens that connected the two, companies in almost undetectable ways. My father was laundering money for him, said Alexander, not as a question but as an inevitable realization. Not exactly. Thomas adjusted his glasses, a nervous habit that Alexander had known since childhood. Your father was too intelligent to get directly involved in illegal activities, but he facilitated certain transactions. He allowed Victor to use legitimate. Morgan projects to transform dirty money into clean investments. And in exchange, Victor financed projects that conventional banks considered too risky. He allowed the company to grow at a speed that would be impossible using only clean capital. Thomas pulled out a specific folder. But there was a clause in all these agreements. If ever the partnership was unilaterally broken by Morgan, Victor would have the right to liquidate all loans immediately, with compound interest calculated retroactively. Alexander mentally did the calculations. It was an astronomical amount, enough to instantly bankrupt the company. He has us in his hands. Had, corrected Thomas with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Your father was many things, Alexander, but he was never naive. He knew that one day he might need to get rid of Victor. The lawyer opened a folder marked with a red seal that Alexander had never seen before. Inside were photographed documents, transcribed recordings, bank records of numbered accounts, a collection of evidence that painted a detailed portrait of Victor's criminal activities. Richard spent years collecting this information, explained Thomas. Every suspicious transaction, every offshore account, every connection to criminal organizations, all meticulously documented. Blackmail, murmured Alexander. Life insurance, corrected Thomas, with specific instructions that it should only be used if Victor threatened the family or tried to take control of the company. Your father predicted exactly this situation. Alexander studied the documents with growing fascination. It was a complete map of Victor's criminal empire, enough to guarantee decades in prison if it reached the right authorities. But it was also a weapon of mutual destruction. Using this information would expose Morgan's own complicity. If I use this against him, said Alexander, the company will also be investigated. Yes, there will be heavy fines, prolonged investigations, possible imprisonment for executives who knew of the irregularities. Thomas closed the folder. But the company would survive. Victor, not. Alexander stood up and walked to the window, observing the city that stretched beyond the bulletproof glass. It was a decision that Richard had carefully architected, forcing his son to choose between the easy and corrupt path and the difficult but honest path. There's one more thing, said Thomas, taking a smaller envelope from the briefcase. Your father left an additional letter, with instructions that it be delivered only if you decided to use the information against Victor. Alexander opened the envelope with fingers that trembled slightly. Richard's familiar handwriting covered a single sheet of paper. Alexander, if you're reading this, it means you chose love instead of power, justice instead of convenience. It means you've finally become the man I always hoped you would be, but never knew how to teach you to be. Use this information, destroy Victor, save the woman you love. And when it's all over, build something new on the ruins of what we destroyed together. You were always better than me. It was just a matter of time until you discovered that on your own. Alexander carefully folded the letter and put it in his shirt pocket. Thomas, I need you to do two things. First, schedule a meeting with the federal prosecutor's office for tomorrow morning. Second, find Emily. Alexander, if you hand over this evidence, I know the consequences. Alexander turned to face the lawyer. But I can't build a life with Emily on a foundation of dirty money and blackmail, and I can't leave Victor free to harm her or anyone else. Thomas sighed, but began organizing the documents back into the briefcases. It will take time to locate Emily. Victor has resources, but we also have them. We don't have time, Sophia gave me until Friday. Alexander looked at the clock. That gives us 3 days. And if we can't find her in time? Alexander picked up the phone and dialed a number he had memorized during his stay at the Grand Summit. When Carlos, the veteran electrician, answered, Alexander said, Carlos, it's Alex. I need a favor. It's about Emily. For the next 20 minutes, Alexander explained the real situation, who he was, who Emily was, and the danger she was in. Carlos listened in silence, interrupting only to ask specific questions about dates and locations. So you really are a rich guy, said Carlos when Alexander finished. Joe won the bet. He always said you were too strange to be a real employee. Will, you help me? Emily is good people. She doesn't deserve to be pursued by any scoundrel, rich or poor. Carlos paused. Besides, you may have lied about who you were, but you never treated anyone here with disrespect. That counts for something. Carlos explained that he had contacts throughout the Smoky Mountains, an informal network of hotel employees, tour guides, local merchants who had known each other for decades. If Emily was hiding in the region, they would find her. But I need you to understand one thing, said Carlos. If we find her, who's going to decide if she wants to talk to you is her. Not you, not me, her. After everything that happened, she has the right to choose. I understand, said Alexander. Just give me a chance to explain and to apologize. After he hung up, Alexander sat on the sofa where Sophia had been a few hours earlier and tried to process the magnitude of what he was about to do. In 3 days, he would destroy everything he had inherited, risk imprisonment, and possibly lose the only woman he had ever truly loved. But for the first time in months, he felt at peace with his choices. The man who had left for the grand summit in search of a lesson about humility had found something much more valuable: the courage to be true no matter the cost. The phone rang. It was Carlos. "Alex, we found her." Alexander closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Where?" "Franklin. She's working in a nursing home, taking care of the elderly. She's using the name Maria Santos now." Carlos hesitated. "But Alex, she's not doing well. People here say she seems haunted, as if she's waiting for something bad to happen." "I'll go get her." "No," Carlos's voice was firm. "You showing up there might scare her even more. Leave it to me. I'll talk to her first, explain the situation. If she agrees to see you, I'll call you." Alexander wanted to protest, wanted to get in the car and drive to Franklin immediately. But he knew Carlos was right. Emily needed time to process the information, to decide if she wanted to face again the world she had left behind. "All right," said Alexander, "but Carlos, tell her that I love her, and that this time there are no lies between us." Emily was taking care of Mrs. Amelia, an 86-year-old lady who had been an elementary school teacher all her life, when Carlos arrived at the St. Vincent de Paul home. It was a Thursday afternoon, and she was helping the elderly woman make a flower arrangement. White daisies she bought every week at the local flower shop, the same flowers that had been the trail that allowed Victor to locate her. The nursing home was a simple but welcoming place, with walls painted in light, yellow and well-maintained gardens where residents spent sunny afternoons. Emily had found peace there, in the slow rhythm of routine, in unhurried conversations with people who had lived entire decades and could offer perspective on what really mattered in life. When she saw Carlos at the reception, talking quietly with the director, Emily felt the familiar world collapse again around her. He was out of place in that environment, with his work overalls and serious expression, and she instinctively knew that her escape had come to an end. "Maria," called the director, "there's a gentleman here who would like to speak with you." Emily carefully placed the daisies in the vase that Mrs. Amelia was holding, smoothed her white apron, and walked to the reception with measured steps. Each meter was an eternity, each breath a conscious effort to maintain the composure she had cultivated during months of hiding. "Hello, Emily," said Carlos softly. "Or should I call you Maria?" "How did you find me?" she asked, surprising herself with the calmness of her own voice. "It wasn't me who found you. It was Alex," he asked. "Me to look for you." Carlos looked around the modest lobby, noticing how Emily seemed perfectly integrated into that environment. "Can we talk in private?" Emily led him to a small garden at the back of the nursing home, where wooden benches were distributed among rose and jasmine beds. It was the place where she came every night, after work, where she had found something resembling serenity in the last few weeks. "He told me everything," said Carlos, without beating around the bush. "Who he really is, who you really are, about the man who's pursuing you, and about how he fell in love with you." Emily sat on one of the benches, fixing her gaze on the red roses that bloomed despite the cold of the mountains. "Alexander Morgan," she murmured. "I should have realized earlier. There was always something different about him." "Are you angry?" "I was. For weeks I was furious." Emily broke a dry rose branch and broke it into small pieces. But then the anger passed, and only sadness remained. For having allowed myself to believe that I could trust again. For having lowered my guard precisely with someone who was lying as much as I was. Carlos sat beside her on the bench. "He didn't lie about his feelings, Emily. I saw how he was after you left. For the last 2 months he worked like a robot, spoke only when necessary, seemed like a man who had lost everything that mattered. And now he wants to find me for what? To apologize? To explain that it was all a romantic misunderstanding?" Emily laughed, but it was a sound without joy. "Or maybe to offer me some kind of financial compensation for the inconvenience of having played with my feelings." "Now he wants to protect you," said Carlos, "and to do that he's willing to destroy everything he inherited." Carlos explained Alexander's plan, how he intended to hand over criminal evidence against Victor to the prosecutor's office, even knowing that it would expose his own company and potentially lead him to prison. How he had chosen justice instead. Of convenience, Emily, instead of the empire. "He's doing this for me?" asked Emily, incredulity coloring her voice. "He's doing it because it's the right thing to do." "But yes, he's also doing it for you." Carlos took an envelope from his pocket. "He asked me to deliver this." Emily took the envelope with hands that trembled slightly. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the handwriting she had learned to recognize during the meetings in the hotel library. "Emily, I don't expect forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I lied about who I was, but I never lied about what I felt for you. Every conversation, every moment of shared silence, every time you smiled, it was all real for me. You taught me that it's possible to be loved for who we are, not for what we possess. Now I'm trying to learn to be worthy of that love. If you agree to see me one last time, I'll be waiting in the library of the Grand Summit tomorrow at sunset. If you don't come, I'll understand, but know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the man you deserved to find from the beginning. Alexander." Emily carefully folded the letter and put it in the pocket of her apron. Is he really going to hand over this evidence? "Tomorrow morning. It's all arranged with the prosecutors." Carlos studied her expression. "Emily, you need to understand something. Victor Harrison won't give up easily. Even if he's imprisoned, he has connections, people who work for him. Alexander can protect you legally, but there will always be the risk of retaliation," completed Emily. "I know, I've lived with that fear for months." "So, are you going to meet him?" Emily was silent for several minutes, watching how the afternoon shadows lengthened among the rose bushes. Finally, she stood up and headed back to the nursing home. I need to think," she said, "and I need to finish my work here. Mrs. Amelia is waiting to finish the flower arrangement." Carlos followed her to the entrance of the building. "Emily, can I say something? Alex may have lied about many things, but one thing was true. He looked at you as if you were the most important person in the world, and in the end, maybe that's what matters." That night, Emily stayed up late, sitting by the window of the small room she occupied in the annex of the nursing home. The view looked out to the mountains that were lost in the darkness, and she tried to imagine Alexander driving along those same roads, returning to the hotel where everything had begun. At 5 in the morning, she made her decision. She asked for leave from the director of the nursing home, claiming a family emergency. She packed her few possessions in a small suitcase, the same one she had brought months ago when she fled from Charleston. Before leaving, she visited each of the elderly people under her care, saying goodbye as if it were a temporary trip, although she knew she would probably never return. Mrs. Amelia held her hand with fragile but surprisingly firm fingers. "You're going to meet him, aren't you?" Emily was surprised. "How do you know?" "I'm 86 years old, dear. I've seen many love stories in my life, and I can tell when someone is fighting against their own heart." The elderly woman smiled. "Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is give a second chance to someone who hurt us, especially if that person is truly trying to be better." The bus to Gatlinburg left at 7 in the morning. Emily chose a window seat and observed the familiar landscape slowly pass by, the hills covered with pine trees, the wooden houses scattered through the valleys, the fields where cows grazed peacefully as if the world around them wasn't full of complications and pain. She arrived at the Grand Summit at 4 in the afternoon. The hotel seemed smaller than she remembered, less imposing, as if the months of absence had reduced its power over her. Mrs. Martha received her with surprise and genuine joy. "Emily, good to see you. I heard that you... I heard that..." "You were well." The manager hesitated. Alexander is waiting for you in the library. He arrived this morning and hasn't left there since then." Emily walked through the familiar corridors with slow steps, mentally preparing herself for the confrontation that would determine the course of the rest of her life. When she reached the library door, she stopped and took a deep breath. On the other side of the wooden door was the man who had broken her heart and, possibly, the only person in the world capable of fixing it again. She opened the door. Alexander was sitting in the same chair where they used to talk, but he looked different, thinner, with deep dark circles under his eyes, wearing a simple suit that had replaced the work uniforms but maintained the same humility she had learned to associate with Alex Santos. When he saw her, he immediately stood up, dropping the book he had been absent-mindedly leafing through. "You came," he said, and there was so much relief in his voice that Emily felt her heart tighten. "I came," she replied, closing the door behind her. "Now explain to me why I should believe anything you say." Alexander stood in the middle of the library for a few seconds, as if he were trying to find words he had never needed to use before. Emily remained near the door, maintaining physical and emotional distance, waiting for an explanation that could justify months of pain and distrust. "You want to know why you should believe me," Alexander finally said. "The truth is that you shouldn't. I spent my entire life being trained to lie when convenient, to hide the truth when it didn't serve my purposes. Lying was a tool, like wearing a tie or shaking hands, something you do without thinking." He slowly approached, stopping when he saw Emily stiffen. "But when I met you, for the first time in my life, I found someone who made me want to be truthful. Not because it was strategic or convenient, but because lying to you physically hurt." Emily crossed her arms, protecting the heart that had already been broken once. "Beautiful words, but you lied for months. About everything. About who I was, yes. About where I had grown up. About my family, about my past. But never about what I felt for you." Alexander took an envelope from the inside pocket of his jacket. "This morning I handed over to the prosecutor's office evidence that will put Victor Harrison in prison for the next 20 years. It will also expose crimes committed by my own company. I may be indicted. I may lose everything I inherited. I may spend years in prison." Emily took the envelope and examined the official stamps, the signatures that confirmed that the legal process was already in motion. "Why did you do this?" "Because it was the right thing to do, and because I couldn't build a life with you on a foundation of dirty money and blackmail." Alexander sat in the chair where they had spent so many afternoons talking. "But I also did it for a selfish reason. I wanted to prove to you that I'm capable of choosing what's right instead of what's easy." Emily approached the window that gave a view of the mountains where she had hidden for months. The afternoon sun painted the peaks in gold, creating a beauty that contrasted with the complexity of the feelings that dominated her. "You know what the worst part of discovering who you really were was?" she asked without turning around. "It wasn't the anger over the lie. It was realizing that everything I felt for you was real but based on an illusion. How could I trust my own feelings if they deceived me so completely?" "You didn't deceive yourself," said Alexander. "The man you fell in love with exists. He's not Alexander Morgan, billionaire heir. He's not Alex Santos, maintenance employee. He's simply a man who discovered that the only thing that really matters is being loved for who he really is." Emily turned to face him. "And who are you, really?" Alexander hesitated, searching for the right words. "I'm someone who spent 30 years learning to be invulnerable, and 3 months discovering that vulnerability is the only courage worth having. I'm a man who grew up believing that power was everything, and discovered that love is the only real form of power. He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm someone who loves you more than he loves his own life, and who has spent the last few months discovering how to live with a broken heart." Emily felt tears burning her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. "And me? Who am I to you? The daughter of the housekeeper your father humiliated, the woman who ran away from an arranged marriage, the maid who cleaned empty rooms while you played at being poor. You're the woman who taught me that there's a difference between existing and living, who showed me that kindness isn't weakness, that simplicity isn't poverty, that love isn't possession." Alexander stood up and walked to her, stopping only when they were close enough for her to see the tears in his eyes. "You're the person who made me understand why my father wrote that will. He knew that I needed to learn to lose everything to discover what was really worth having." Emily extended her hand and touched Alexander's face, feeling the stubble, the lines of tiredness around his eyes, the tangible reality of the man who was standing before her. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Of what?" of believing again, of giving myself again, of waking up one day and discovering that this too was an illusion. Emily let her hand slide to his chest, feeling the accelerated beats of his heart. Of falling in love even more and discovering that you're not the man I'm seeing now. Alexander covered her hand with his. I'm afraid too, afraid of not being worthy of your love, afraid of disappointing you again, afraid of waking up and discovering that you've changed your mind about giving me a second chance. They stayed like that for several minutes, close enough to feel each other's breath, far enough that there was still room for doubts and fears. If we stay together, Emily finally said, how will it be? You without money, possibly fleeing from justice, me without family, without past, with nothing beyond what I can build with my own hands. It won't be the glamorous life you knew. It will be better, Alexander replied without hesitation. It will be real. Emily smiled for the first time since she had entered the library. It was a small smile, still loaded with caution, but genuine. Are you sure? Because this time there will be no masks, no lies, no going back. If we stay together, it will be forever, with everything that means. Alexander held her face between his hands, looking directly into her green eyes. Emily Bennett Crawford, who became Emily Williams, who became Maria Santos, and who I hope will become Emily Morgan. I love you. I don't love a fantasy or an idealization. I love you. Your scars, your fears, your courage, your ability to start over as many times as necessary. I love the woman who is strong enough to flee from a life she didn't choose and brave. Enough to give a second chance to a man who didn't deserve the first. And I love you, said Emily, finally letting the tears flow freely. I love the man who learned to change light bulbs with hands that were made to sign contracts, who discovered that there are things more valuable than money, who chose to do what's right even when it would cost everything he possessed. When they kissed, it was different from the timid and tension-loaded kisses they had shared months ago. This kiss was a promise, a commitment, a declaration that they were choosing to build something new on the ruins of what they had lost. 6 months later, Alexander was sentenced to 2 years of house arrest and a heavy fine for complicity in money laundering. He lost 80% of his paternal inheritance, but kept enough to start over. Victor Harrison was sentenced to 25 years in prison and had all his assets confiscated. Alexander and Emily married in a simple ceremony, in the chapel of the Grand Summit, with only the hotel employees as witnesses. Carlos was the best man, Mrs. Martha the matron of honor. Emily wore a simple white dress she had bought in a local store, Alexander a suit that cost less than his former ties. They bought a small house in the mountains, with enough garden for Emily to cultivate the flowers she had always loved, and space for Alexander to learn to cook the recipes she patiently taught him. He set up a small consulting firm. She opened a floral arrangement studio. They weren't rich, but they were happy in a way that wealth had never provided. On cold winter nights, they would sit in front of the fireplace that Alexander had learned to light, reading books to each other, talking about simple dreams and modest plans. Emily wore on her finger the engagement ring that Alexander had chosen, not an expensive diamond, but a small emerald that matched her green eyes. He wore on his wrist his father's watch, finally repaired, but adjusted to mark not the time lost, but the time they had ahead. And when Emily finally gave herself completely to Alexander, on a spring night when the daisies bloomed in her garden, it was she who chose when and how, dictating the conditions of an intimacy that was hers by right and hers to give. There was no rush, no pressure, just the love of two people who had learned that true wealth isn't measured in money, but in the ability to be completely known and still completely loved. Alexander Morgan had inherited an empire and chosen love. Emily Crawford